Hey folks, welcome back to Ken Michaels Radio. I've been having so much fun interviewing people, talking about the Beatles here on this channel. And as you know, I interview authors, podcasters, people who have worked with the Beatles. And on today's show, we're bringing back my esteemed colleagues. I've had them here on my channel. I've had them on my other podcast shows. Let me welcome each one of them to you, introduce each one. We'll go from top to bottom here on the screen. First of all, we have a man who has written so many Beatle books. The Beatles on Capitol Records, the Beatles on VJ, the solo records on the solo Beatles on Apple Records, a lot of what I would consider companion books for the anniversaries, 50th anniversaries for Sgt. Pepper, the White Album, Let It Be, Abbey Road. Also, most recently, it hasn't even left my side here, this book, Magical Mystery Tour and Yellow Submarine. And that is Beatles author and historian, Bruce Spizer. Hi, Bruce.
Greetings. Glad to be back with you. Particularly fun since with Al and Tom, the three of us can gang up on you at any time.
I expect that. I am expecting that at any given moment. And please do. We also have back with us Tom Frangione. Tom has had a lengthy career doing all kinds of work on the Beatles, being a writer for Beatle Fan Magazine, as has Bruce and our other guest. Also, he's helped out Joe Johnson's Beatle Brunch for many years, and also a big part of the Fest for Beatle Fans, where he's been part of panel discussions, interviewing people, sound-alike contests, you name it. And for several years now, since the beginning of SiriusXM's Beatles channel, he's taken part in many of their shows. And in fact, he's now co-hosting 3 of their shows. Yeah. There is Fab Forum, Way Beyond Compare, and Apple Jam. Yep. He is a busy guy, to say the least.
Yep.
Tom Frangione, welcome back.
Oh, it's great to be back here, Ken. Happy New Year to my 3 esteemed colleagues here. I think we're going to have a great deal of fun tonight catching up on all things Beatles. And you actually picked a good week to do this, Ken. Don't know if you're doing this, but I've heard, and some people called last night, they're rewatching Get Back in 53-year real time. That's to say, on January 5th, they watched just what happened on January 5th. And on January 6th, they watch it. So we have a week off while George is, reevaluating his future. So hopefully we get all those folks who would otherwise be wrapped up watching Get Back again.
It's kind of reminding me of what Mark Lewison was doing. Wasn't it like last year? He was living each day exactly on the anniversary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we're all copying Mark. That's what
wild stuff. Well, those folks have a busy and a great couple of weeks to look forward to coming up. They got a great 10-day run coming their way if that's how they're doing this.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And also we have back once again Al SUSSMAN. Al is a longtime writer for Beatle Fan Magazine. He's also the author of the book Changing Times, 101 Days That Shaped a Generation. In case you don't know about that book, it's all about the 101 days that followed the President Kennedy assassination and what went on in our country, all the changes in our culture at that time. And also, for several years, he was a co-host of mine on the Things We Said Today podcast. And he's been a welcome guest here and back on Things We Said Today once in a while, and on my other podcast, Talk More Talk. Al SUSSMAN, welcome again.
Good. How are you, gentlemen?
Well, good to stand back together.
And with Bruce here, I should mention that I'm also part of the Beatles album series team.
Right.
With Bill King and Piers Hemmingson and Frank Daniels and this guy in New Orleans.
Oh, that's me. That's right. Yeah, that's me.
Yes, that's you.
And we just did our show on that very book that I held up on Magical Mystery Tour and Yellow Submarine, if you want to check that out. And these guys are welcome back anytime to talk about whatever new books they have or whatever topics they want to. I'm easy, like a Sunday morning.
Yeah.
Anyway, today we're going to talk about the Get Back documentary. I got to tell you folks something. I can never get enough of talking about this. This is the most fascinating thing. It's the greatest release for Beatle fans to me since the Beatles anthology. And
Agreed.
even though we've done a show on things we said today and Talk More Talk on Get Back, everybody's doing shows on Get Back. And it's so much fun because you gain so much insight from what everybody else observes that maybe you didn't pick up on. And no matter how many times you watch this, you're gonna see something you didn't see before, or pick up on something that one of the Beatles said in the documentary that maybe you didn't pick up before. This is something that I'm going to be watching many times over in my lifetime, and I don't say that about a lot of videos. I really don't. But we're going to be talking about that in just a few moments. But before we do that, I thought it'd be a great. I think we should pay our respects here to a legendary singer who just passed away in the last few days, Ronnie Spector. One of those people that as soon as you hear her voice, you know who she is. Um, Without a doubt, one of the classic singers in the history of rock. Of course, the lead singer with the Ronettes, known for hits like "Be My Baby" and "Walking in the Rain," "Baby I Love You." She also has a history with the Beatles and with Apple Records because she had a contract with them, putting out the single of "Try Some Buy Some." Although the original intention was to make an album with Ronnie Spector on Apple Records. So I thought that everybody here would like to say words about her passing and your memories of Ronnie. And I know that she's been a guest at the fest for Beatle fans, and she was also interviewed on Fab Forum on one of your shows, Tom.
Yep.
Who would like to start? You want to start, Tom?
Sure. First time I met Ronnie was at the Fest for Beatle fans. I think we've tagged that, Al, right, as 2009.
Yeah, at least the obit that was in the New York Times this morning said 2009.
Sounds about right. It sounds like it's
Yeah.
at least 10 years ago. Obviously, a big deal. I mean, this is a rock and roll Hall of Famer, a big name, certainly, and a local favorite here in New York. And it was obviously great having her there. We did get to interview her on the Fab Forum. She was one of our first guests in our maiden year, 2017. We had her for about a half hour, and one of my partners on that show, Dennis Elsis, and her we'll call it go way back, to the Ronettes days. So there was a lot of old home week going on there. And I had gotten to just catch up with her off mic and off the air the same year, 2017, up at Sirius. She was always very accommodating. She was a good friend of cousin Brucey, who we'd see roaming the halls all the time up at Sirius, and she was accessible, always accommodating. To talk, take a picture, whatever you wanted to do. Obviously, her presence in the Beatles story on Apple Records, we've talked about David Frick and I on the Apple Jam program. Unfortunately, as you say, Ken, her recorded output is limited to the one single, Tandoori Chicken and Try Some Buy Some. But if you know where to look, with your local Dutch import dealer, there are tracks from those sessions that are in circulation, and they're very good. I would love to know that at some point those could be dusted off for either a separate, I don't know, a record store day thing or something to come from Apple. It would be really, really grand, I think.
Absolutely. And if anyone's interested, Try Some Buy Some. The recording of Ronnie's version of George's song was released on the compilation of Come and Get It, the best of Apple Records. I think that was in 2010. And Tandoori Chicken was actually a song that George Harrison co-wrote with Phil Spector.
Yeah, they did that.
So,
It was kind of like an in the studio, kind of just whipped together thing, but a fun little record.
right.
It caught the ear even of John Lennon. Again, if you get to your local Dutch import dealer and get the recording of John's birthday party that year, they're sitting around and playing guitars and doing everything from little, Mickey takes of Uncle Albert to she'll be coming around the mountain, and they bust into a verse of Tandoori Chicken. So it was something that got on everybody's radar, it seemed.
Yeah. Okay. Al, some memories that you have of Ronnie?
Well, actually, on top of what Tom was just saying, just technically, Ronnie's input on Apple is a little bit more than just the one single, in that the 1963 Christmas Gift to You, Phyllis Records, was reissued on Apple for Christmas in 72 or 71, Tom.
I'm sorry, Al, which was 72 or 71?
The
Phil
Phil
Spector.
Spector Christmas album.
Oh, that's 72, I believe, on Apple.
Okay, right.
Yeah,
So
with Phil in the Santa Claus suit and the back to mono button.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. But I thought of a couple of things, a couple of memories last night. One is that, and this was it was mentioned again in the obit that was in the New York Times this morning, that she did a series of Christmas shows at the old BB King's on 42nd Street in Manhattan in the early 2000s. And I saw one of those, and as it turns out, part of her backup band for at least a couple of those was our old mutual friend, Glenn Burtnick.
Yep.
Oh, very nice.
Yeah.
From Liverpool and the Weaklings. Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
We used to tag team sometimes, have Ronnie and Darlene Love do like a double bill over at BB King's.
Yeah.
That's always special, you know.
Yeah, exactly. And the other one is what Tom mentioned before, Ronnie's first experience at the fest in 2009. And the one I remember, and we were talking about this before we began rolling here, and Bruce mentioned that it was at the Jersey Fest that year. What I remember is Ronnie got there late on Friday.
Yeah.
And so they had to do the sound check basically after the session on after all the regular activities on Friday night. And but she wanted an audience. And so Mark Lapidus is basically running around trying to recruit people, most of us from the staff, and people like Bruce, to serve as an audience for her.
Yeah.
And I believe that was the night that she turned to the band, to Liverpool, and said, what was it? I think the quote was, "You sound exactly like the record."
Like the record.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, what got her, it was more of, it was there, there are only four of you, because she was looking around expecting this big backing track behind her, and it was the four guys. I remember that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's a testament to how good a band Liverpool is.
Oh yeah,
that
Liverpool,
a lot of
great,
sound.
great backing band. And I remember when I saw Donovan performing at Radio City Music Hall, part of the David Lynch show, and he had a band behind him. And I thought, I saw him in front of Liverpool a few years ago, much better. So they're a great house band. My big Ronnie Spector memory just, goes way back through the Wayback Machine of, hearing Be My Baby on the radio. And, her voice was as powerful as that drumming introduction, which has been used countless times over. That standard dum, 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 boom.
Yeah.
And the same thing with her voice. And then I remember seeing, but not having the money to buy, the Ronettes album, and thinking, yeah, that's an interesting looking group there. So, my main memories, in addition to, of course, the ones we all talked about at the fest for Beatle fans, and boy, did she belt out those songs, was just hearing Be My Baby blasting through, your transistor radio or school bus radio or whatever. It was a song at the time that just was unlike anything else, as far as I could. I mean, I love the work that Spector did with the Crystals, but Be My Baby took it to another level.
And we all know Brian Wilson thought that Be My Baby is the greatest pop record ever.
Greatest record ever made.
Yeah. And actually, I always liked Baby I Love You
Oh,
more.
yeah. What?
And I've always felt that it would have been a bigger hit than it actually was, except that it began to peak right at the moment that I Want to Hold Your Hand was taking off. And then right on top of that, She Loves You was reissued. Please Please Me was reissued.
Yeah.
And on and on.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's a great observation. There's a New Orleans soul singer, great singer, Irma Thomas.
Yes.
And she used to complain about the fact is I put out this great song on Imperial Records, and I'm finally on the big national distribution. Wish someone would care. And what happens? The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Dave Clark Five, Herman's Hermits. It only gets to 16 on the charts. Any other time, this would have been, top 5.
Yeah.
I think she's right. It would have been.
Yeah, absolutely.
To Bruce's point with that drum intro, boom, 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 pow. I mean, Billy Joel fans out there will instantly
say goodbye to Hollywood.
Say goodbye to Hollywood for sure.
Yeah.
And Ringo's used it a time or two as well.
Right, but I mean, it's one she's covered. It was almost too obvious to do, right? But
yeah, a few times when I've interviewed the guys in the Weaklings, and Liverpool at the same time, I like to comment about how highly I think of them as musicians, backing up all the artists that have been at the fest. But if there ever was proof of how great they were, Try Some, Buy Some is a very difficult song to perform. It's got all these different time signatures in it, and it's hard for a band to keep up and just be, in strict time with the song.
That was the one where Ronnie was really looking over his shoulder, looking around, going, "Where's the rest of the music coming from?"
Yeah, they're very, very, flexible and broad in their capabilities. One of the highlights, and again, you think of them, banging out Beatles songs. Look, they do this, that's their stock in trade. But backing up the guests, whether it's Joey Molland or Donovan or Ronnie. One of the ones I remember best, and they did have to call in one bit of artillery there, and that was Mark Rivera. When Norman Smith, Hurricane Smith was there, and Oh Babe, What Would You Say? Now, that is a hard song to play. Those are some incredible jazz chords in there, and the arrangements and harmonies are really, really intricate. And they knocked it out of the park. And when Rivera took over on the sax and Hurricane started dancing with his wife, I mean, that was like a top 5 all-time fest moment for me.
I agree. And just to hear him perform that, and he probably hadn't done it live since the 70s, or when it was a hit.
Years or something, right? Yeah. No, it was great. It was a great moment.
Yeah. And the one thing I wanted to say about Ronnie Spector, I never got to talk to her at all, but I certainly saw her quite a bit in concert, because she did perform at Mohegan Sun in Connecticut. And almost every time it would be close to Christmas. So she can work in the Christmas songs with her hits. And like you guys have said, her voice was so close to what it was in the early 60s. And I pay careful attention to that stuff. Because as artists get older and older, they got to keep at it to keep their voices strong. And most of the time, Ronnie only performed towards the end of the year. So how did she do that? She must have really, kept in shape with her voice when she was home, because she really was strong with her vocals.
Yeah.
And, I'm very grateful that I got to see her definitely 2 times, maybe 3 times at Mohegan Sun. Always a treat to see her.
Yeah, and she made some records that, unfortunately didn't get a lot of exposure in the later days. There's one great one. It was, I guess, technically an EP. I think it was 5 songs of her doing 5 Marshall Crenshaw songs. Called Something's Gonna Happen. And I mean, to say that this was just a brilliant match, that thing's worth finding a copy of out there on Amazon or eBay for sure.
Yeah. And actually, she made an album in 2014. I'm not sure if it was her last album. It's called English Heart. And every song on there was a cover version of a British band from the 60s. So she did one Beatles song. She did I'll Follow the Sun. She did Jerry and the Pacemakers, the Animals, the Dave Clark Five. The Zombies. Sandy Shaw, so yeah, if you can check it out. I know I've featured her version of I'll Follow the Sun on my show, Every Little Thing. So
matter of fact, Dennis ended the Fab Forum last night by playing her version of I'll Follow the Sun.
Oh, very nice.
Actually, we were inspired by her. It's actually her official website. That's the one the family put up on the
right.
So we thought we'd salute that way.
Okay, very nice. So Ronnie Spector, she will definitely be missed.
Yeah.
So let's get to our main topic, which is the Get Back documentary. I'm going to mix some very general questions, which sometimes could be the most interesting, you get the most interesting reactions to and responses to, with some specific ones. But I wanted to start by asking you guys, was this documentary what you expected it to be? Now, before you even answer this question, obviously, we first heard it was going to be more like a 2-hour movie. Then it became 6 hours. And then lo and behold,
like a week before it comes out.
It's less, just under 8 hours. I mean, my God, have we been spoiled here? No. But was this documentary what you thought it was going to be? Because we all have certain expectations. I know there was all this talk that this was going to be a whitewash. That was a main concern for a lot of fans. We all have been brought up with the same narrative for the last 50 years of what these sessions were like. Do you think this was a very accurate portrayal of that time, of that month, January of 1969? And, was this what you thought it was going to be overall? So
the first question's easy.
Yeah.
Was it a whitewash? No.
No.
I didn't think it was going to be, because I thought Peter Jackson had too much integrity. Plus, people knew George quit the band. You have to somehow feature that. So I knew it wasn't going to be a whitewash. He didn't whitewash World War I either. So, I'm just saying I was expecting it to be that. I also had a little bit of a warning, and then I read somewhere that it was going to have a lot of talk. And I thought, well, that's good, and that we're going to learn a lot. But on the other side, I'm doing the math at the time was 6 hours, and I'm thinking that means we're going to get a lot of edited performances. And that, unfortunately, is what we got. But I understand, to keep a documentary going, you can't have 4.5 minutes of I lost my little girl. You can have 30 seconds maybe of I lost my little girl, if it was even that long. And so in a way, that to me was a disappointment, and we may talk about it again later, as the end of the film to a certain extent, which is, all I can say is, folks, when Let It Be comes out remastered, you're going to need it. But that said, I thought it was great. It exceeded my expectations, certainly. The first time I watched it, I was so busy taking notes that I didn't enjoy it as much as I did. And then I think the main testament to it is I've listened to all 83 CDs and all that other stuff. And yet still, when it was over, there were a few things I learned that, hey, I did not know that. And Tom and I were talking about that. And it's really cool when you can, watch something on the Beatles, and as well as we know it, still learn something new. That's really cool.
Agreed.
Yeah. Well, we're going to address the things that you learned that you never knew before a little bit later on. Al, how about you?
Well, it was, as far as whether it was what I expected, I wasn't sure going in exactly what to expect, except that I had gotten at least about 4 hours of prep hearing Peter Jackson on Things We Said Today.
Okay.
a week or so before.
Yeah.
So I kind of knew somewhat what to expect. But I think it was, as far as the whole whitewash nonsense. I mean, I knew going in that was not going to be the case. and yet, of course, there's still people, brainless people out there who still, oh well, that's Yoko was real quiet. I'm sure there was all this stuff where she was talking and being intrusive or whatever, which is nonsense. But I think the fact that there were no talking heads, so to speak, there was no contemporary commentary, I think was very good. Basically, Jackson simply presented the 8 hours of the story and told the story extremely well. I think he paced it all very, very well, even to the point of having the quote unquote cliffhanger at the end of the first one.
I know that was brilliant. It felt like a soap opera,
Yeah.
at the end of the first part.
Right, and especially the kind of the hangover at the beginning of the second part, with Paul and Ringo basically sitting there, was it with the Monday afterward, and wondering whether they were seeing the end of the group.
Right.
And Linda's participation in that, to me, was revealing too, to see Linda making very astute observations.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was really cool.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah. Tom, your thoughts?
Well, first I'm going to come completely clean and say what I said on the Fab Forum many times in the weeks leading up to this, is I was still kind of hedging my bet, because a lot of what we were told is you're going to see four guys getting along great and it's all kumbaya moments. And I said, you know what? I know there's 53 years, of rear view mirror here, but go back and listen to the David Wigg interviews. Go back and listen to the Playboy interview. Go back and listen to the Rolling Stone interview. Listen to any of the contemporaneous interviews from 1969 where they said, oh my God, this was torture. This was the worst. It was a drag. It was this, it was that. So that's going to be kind of a tough sell to say that, everybody was getting along and having a great time. Again, much to my relief, and I'm sure the relief of millions of people, it wasn't a whitewash. I mean, there were times when you can see, if not discontent, you saw disharmony, okay, if not discontent, and there's a fine line there. Your question, Ken, was, was it what we expected? Well, as soon as, they announced the expansion to 8 hours, up from 6, and that was only maybe 10 days before showtime. Again, all I was waiting for is now tell me it's going up to 10. Keep bringing it. But now, looking back at that, I would challenge any of you or anyone who's watching, go back and watch it again and tell me what 2 hours you'd cut.
Yeah.
I know.
It would seem like a gaping hole. What 2 hours would you cut? So I think Peter Jackson's taste and discretion in how much of that film it would take to paint all the corners. Obviously, it's the reason he's the gifted filmmaker and storyteller that he is.
Unfortunately, he is a lousy editor. He just cannot get it down to a normal size.
That's
I say that tongue in cheek. I think he's a brilliant editor.
Right, absolutely.
That's to our benefit.
Yes.
I can say this, my biggest takeaway at the end, and this is how I've explained it to people who are maybe not as big as Beatle enthusiasts as we are, but have watched it and said, oh my God, what a great story this was, is I actually think it being a music documentary is kind of the bronze medal here. I think there are two medals that go ahead of it. And the first is that it's an absolute masterclass in, as a character study. These are four guys, remember, who are in their mid to late 20s, okay, who come in, admittedly, at the beginning with nothing. How many songs do we have? None. Okay. And where
Although
the
Paul had a pretty full back pocket.
yeah, well, where the gold medal comes in is it becomes an absolute, an absolute, again, I'll use the word masterclass in the art of compromise and negotiation. I mean, I love to watch them create and see how songs came together and how harmonies worked and what everyone's creative input. The creative input was only made possible, in my opinion, by that art of compromise and negotiation throughout the whole thing. I mean, and you got Michael Lindsay Hogg, he's getting this close to just being too onerous, like, oh, well, are we going to film it on the boat and whatever? You're halfway through and they're still asking, is this a TV show? Is it a documentary? Are we making an album? Is this gearing up for a live show? Is it a documentary about gearing up for a live show? They're mixing and matching.
Right.
If they had started with an absolute end result, we have to perform 10 songs on the roof in 30 days. Okay. And it was a start and a finish, and that was the goal and the focus and the stated purpose. You can say, okay, they're working toward the goal a little bit each and every day. The fact that it was going back and forth, and whether we're going to tour and take it on the road, and then George doesn't want to go, but then he says he'll go, but Ringo's not going. I mean, it was, some herding of cats there.
Right.
It only got done through that, constant evolution of negotiation and compromise. I think that was really the story that was told here. And then at the end, and again, I've told this to folks who would recognize big titles and things. I said, remember, look at the very beginning. What do we got, guys? Well, we got nothing. Okay. I said, and in 30 days, which, let's face it, is really 21 or 22 days, they walk out with Let It Be, Long and Winding Road. They're working on something, half of Abbey Road, Get Back, Don't Let Me Down. That's a career for any other band. This is 4 guys in their mid-20s banging this out in a month.
Right.
Two of us.
Yeah.
One after 909 resurrected.
Yeah.
No big deal.
Yeah.
But as we pointed out, there are certain songs that in '68 they were working on, for example, Let It Be, and well, I'm talking about the stuff like John bringing in like Me, Mr. Mustard, and Polythene Pam, and Let It Be from Paul, which we were treated to, on the White Album box set. So they weren't, all brand new songs, but the. What's that?
But even George, though, like one of the things, again, maybe I'm jumping the gun on things we learned, when they're working on something, and we all heard the story about, loves me like something attracts me like a pomegranate and a cauliflower. Right. He says something there where I said, wait a minute. He says, yeah, I've been chewing on this one for 6 months.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, let's run the calendar. That takes you back to the summer of '68. It could have been on the White Album. It comes out at the very end of the summer, early fall of '69. So that thing had a life, start to finish, of a year.
Right.
Okay, it's a 3-minute record. The lesson, I guess, intuitively that we learn is it takes way more than 3 minutes to write a 3-minute pop song. I mean, it just does.
Yeah.
But
sure.
Just those little, those creative moments where, I'll use this case of something where, George is saying, oh, attracts me like, I don't know what. And they're like, just put in whatever, work on the arrangement. You can fill the lyric later. He's getting that not as a, concession from John and Paul, like they're tolerating him. They're actually telling him, this will help you. You've got a great rhythm and a great melody, and you've got everything here. You've got a great framework. Finish that. The words you should be able to just drop in. Again, seeing how that works, and we'll talk about how it worked on some of the other songs, I'm sure, later. But there's one that, I still sit back and marvel at just how it came together. But we'll save that for a little bit later in the discussion.
Yeah. Okay. For me personally, I always thought there's, as much as I marvel at the outpouring of creativity of all these songs being created, brand new songs, bringing back old songs, songs that ended up in their solo careers, songs that ended up on Abbey Road. Beyond all that, this really is so much a character study of these four guys and how they work together. And I found it so interesting, John and Paul, and how their roles changed from the very beginning to the very end. In the very beginning, Paul is the one who's really trying to drive the band. He's the one that's very gung-ho and very, I think that he's panicking a bit if the band is not progressing rapidly enough. And it shows in the way that he's giving direction. And then eventually when George leaves the band and John has his talk with Paul, and says, you got to give George more respect and all this other stuff. Once they move to Abbey Road, really in a way, John kind of takes over. Paul said to John, I'm not comfortable being the leader. You're the leader. And I think that once things changed and they went over to Apple Studios, John really was leading the way.
Yeah.
And I think they were much more relaxed. Of course, Billy Preston was a great help too.
Well,
but
that is something we've all heard for years.
Of course.
When they moved to Apple, Billy Preston is there, and you don't act up and play out all your air your dirty laundry in front of company, right? And everybody's on their best behavior. Guess what else happened? The songs, the playing went from 0 to 60.
Yeah.
Okay, on their
Absolutely.
the performances, not just their behavior and their attitude and their drive. The songs, you can see it in Paul's face the first time they go through a song with him.
And Tom, I mean, you're just hitting on that so much about Preston's doing it. What I love is before that, you hear John talking about, well, it'd be great if we had a keyboard here, but then if we put a keyboard there, then we don't have two guitars.
Yeah.
And then George, well, we need a fifth member. I mean, everything, we know what's coming.
Yeah.
Imagine what this would be like for someone who didn't know what was coming to think, oh my God, they got their wish. Billy Preston showed up.
And George,
foreshadowing moments, sure.
Yeah.
And George makes, in fact, a reference to Billy Preston.
Exactly.
Right. So
and perfect setup.
And the innocence of it as the Billy Preston thing unfurls. Again, George is 20. He's going to be 26 the following month.
Yeah.
They're talking and they're like, oh yeah, how are we going to pay him? Like, do we put him on the record, or how does he get paid? Should we?
I mean, a session man like Nicky Hopkins would get session. We have to at least give him session money.
No idea what they were going to do with him. They knew they're going to do something. And John, he offers the ultimate mouthful. I could do with a fifth Beatle. Okay. Stop and take that one in. I could do with a fifth Beatle.
Oh yeah, you and I could take it in, but Paul shot it down right away.
Yeah.
He said four's enough trouble as it is.
Well, Paul had his hands full. He's, look, to say he was the alpha male in this thing is an understatement, right?
Sure.
Musically, creatively, from an organization or leadership or drive perspective, he's clearly the alpha male during this whole thing.
Well, he's trying to fill the void of Brian.
Well, he's trying to fill a lot of voids. He's picking up, where John and George and Ringo might be, a bit disinterested at times. He's keeping the fire stoked. There's a point where I actually turned to Lisa and said, at what point do you think they just get sick of him being not overbearing, but being that good? Like when Billy Preston and George are working on Old Brown Shoe at the piano, and George, look, he's a guitar player and he's banging out chords and asking Billy Preston, if I add an F sharp, what is that? And this is why I can't do it on the guitar. And I'm loving the creativity. Yeah. And he says, and we'll put a guitar solo here, and McCartney walks in. There's no left-handed guitar. What does he do? He picks up a right-hand guitar, plays it upside down and backwards. At what point do they get sick of him being that good? Okay, he is firing on all cylinders at this point. He really is.
Plus I guess probably the most famous moment in the entire 8 hours is that moment where Now this was at now it was at Twickenham. I think it was still at Twickenham, and Paul's there with facing George and Ringo, and he just starts strumming away on his bass.
Who's
on a guitar, but just on his bass.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And as if it's out of the ether, we get back.
Yeah, I wish that
George is yawning.
If the film had been a little bit longer, they could have showed what happened prior to Paul doing that. Paul's just riffing what I say. And he's saying, what I say, and then his boy, you got to carry that way. Well, and all of a sudden it morphs into Get Back.
What's interesting is, to me, I love, the other Apple acts. So when they, there's a Mary Hopkin album being passed around, I'm watching for whatever. But, this is one we've talked about on the Fab Forum, one I've pointed out to friends, because uniformly everyone is blown away by that moment Al just described, where he seemingly gets, Get Back out of thin air. And I say, well, he played on a record by Jackie Lomax called Sour Milk Sea, where it's get back to where you should be. You don't belong there. Get back. You don't belong there. Get back to where you once belong. I'm not saying he rips it off from there. I'm saying that it's in the ether at that point, and maybe it's rattling around the back of his head. Who knows?
I think that Tom. I think he definitely came from there, and he also gives a tribute. And one of the things of, for me, a missed opportunity not being in the film or on the album, the box set, is they do sort of a pseudo, almost Germanized type Get Back on it. And Paul sings it in Jackie Lomax's style. And one person says, yeah, that's good, Jackie. So, I mean, I think he's acknowledging this is it's certainly influenced by Jackie Lomax. I don't see how you can miss it.
So does that make McCartney-Harrison composition, in your opinion, Bruce?
If I were George at the time, I would have said, that'd be kind of nice. Pick up an extra little royalty on Get Back.
Yeah. I mean, you could
imagine the single saying Lennon, McCartney, Harrison, sir.
Yeah. No, I mean, look, if you take the position that, it's rooted in Sour Milk Sea, you have to say, I mean, people have gotten songwriting credit for a whole lot less than that.
Yeah.
So just putting that out there, Ken, for your
okay.
See what they think.
All right, can we just backtrack one moment? Because one thing that puzzled me concerning Billy Preston, I've always been told the reason why Billy was there was all because of George wanting him there. And that's never really established in the documentary. Like you said, he's talking about Billy Preston, seeing him with Ray Charles, saying that Billy's even better than Ray Charles. And then all of a sudden he pops into their session.
Yeah.
Well, it's the story supposedly is that I think it was George and Eric Clapton saw Ray Charles and went backstage and talked to Billy and George, drop by Apple sometime. So I think that, it wasn't a coincidence that Billy just popped up. I think the stars were properly aligned for some reason. If Ray Charles hadn't been on tour and George had seen him with Clapton, then Get Back would not be what it was.
Sure.
Okay.
So we're very fortunate Ray Charles was on tour at that time.
Yeah. Thank you, Ray.
Yeah.
One more thing to love about Ray Charles.
And there's plenty.
Yes, indeed.
Let me ask a specific question, because I know a lot of fans like to bring this up about All Things Must Pass, the song, which they rehearsed quite a lot in January. What do you believe is the reason why the group never did record the song? Now, I know that George said during that month that he didn't want them to do it live because he's not pleased with the way that they do their songs live. They always come out shitty. I think he said words to that effect, but it's another thing for it to be a studio recording. And even if they didn't do it for Let It Be, they could have done it for Abbey Road.
Yeah, I will tell you what's really frustrating to me, because I've listened to many versions of them working on it, and I don't know if there is a complete take that I would say is really good. I mean, you come close maybe once, but what you see on it is in the creative process. And look, Paul's brilliant in that film, but Paul also has some clunkers. One of Paul's biggest clunkers was the backing vocals for All Things Must Pass.
Yeah.
Absolutely horrendous. And they spend a lot of time trying to get it right, and it doesn't work. And look, and I'm glad Paul tries stuff like that, because a lot of other stuff he tries is brilliant and it works. And what it shows, and why I wish it had been in the film, and maybe it's in the 18-hour cut, is it shows, Paul and the other Beatles coming up with ideas that they try and don't work. Same thing with Don't Let Me Down, where there's some very corny backing vocals. And Paul's saying, well, if you do it this way, it's not going to be corny. And I'm thinking, no, it's incredibly corny. Unfortunately, they don't do that. But on the other hand, Paul's the one who really, tells John the proper arrangement for Don't Let Me Down. And then this, and it had an entire section, which Paul says, no, you don't need that. No. So, I mean, the creative process is fascinating, but I think All Things Must Pass was a victim of, Paul and putting ideas that didn't work. And I think the song would have been better if George had just said, this is my song. We're going to pretend we're the band and we're going to do it like this. It would have been better. And maybe it gets done that way. I think, this was one time where Paul's ideas, I think, sank a song, not intentionally. It just happened.
I'm going to go counterpoint to that one, Bruce. This is a song I was mentioning a minute ago where I said the creative process. Right, so George starts, and we hear it in the box set. He says it's very bandy.
Right.
The first time I heard it, I'm thinking he wants a big band sound, but I'm going, no, he just came back from Woodstock, seeing the band and Dylan, and that's what he wants. Okay, so they're going through it, and you see it in the Get Back movie, and you can hear it in the box set. Everything about the song is very earthy. Sunrises, sunsets, winds, earth, daylight, daybreak. It's very, very earth-based. And John is reading the lyrics to the second verse where it says, a wind can blow those clouds away. Wind, another earth thing, right? And John reads it because it's just, it spikes in the handwriting and it looks like wind. And John says at the end, keep it as wind, all right, keep it as mind, because it adds some psychedelia to it. And George is like, okay, that might be good. Go look at, when we're done, go look at your All Things Must Pass box set, not your Let It Be box set, where there's the handwritten lyrics. It's in George's beautiful handwriting, and where it says a wind can blow, it's like written in red, and then there's a big black M over it. M, a mind. Now, this we were talking about co-writing. Does one word change it? Well, I'm going to put this for it. He doesn't change one word. He doesn't change not even one letter. He turns one letter upside down, for God's sake. Okay? And wind becomes mind, but say what you want about John, however, flighty and inconsistent he may have been during some of these sessions, he's spot on here.
Absolutely.
It is absolutely a turning point in that song. And there's loads of trial and error, like on harmonies and things like you say, Bruce. But I think in this case, that changed the song to the point where when we hear George do his solo demo, when he starts doing these things again in February, the wind is gone, the mind is there.
Yeah,
I think he's not quite sure where he's taken it yet. And when you put that up against the backdrop of something that took a year to write, I don't think he had a problem dragging this one out another month to say, am I going to keep it that earthy, or am I going to make it maybe something a little bit more, psychedelic or, or flighty like that. And I think that was the right move. You are right. I mean, I've heard all those outtakes and things that you have too. There, it's one of the great crimes in Beatle history that there is not a complete, and I'll even say a complete serious take on that song. Every one of them seems, I don't know if we can say this on YouTube, they seem half-assed, every single one of them.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't even think Giles was able to edit one complete performance to, for the box set.
That's the point.
Nice if he could.
There was nothing really to go with.
Yeah, it's as if the George's vision of it as being a bandy type song doesn't really register with John and Paul. They may not even at that point may not even have been all that familiar with the band.
Yeah,
it's conceivable, but by the time you get to the demo that you just mentioned from February, it's that complexion, the band type complexion is gone.
Yeah, totally.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And even on the composite, let's call it what it is, the one in the box set, it's not clearly not one straight take, but the fact that they put in that part where George is saying, and if you want to join in here, you can. It may have been like, I don't know if disinterest is the word, but I mean, I'd hate to think they're going, okay, all things past, got it. Great, George. What else you got? Because if not, we can work on Dig a Pony right now. He was still, and I know we're going to talk about the flower pot scene. He's clearly still in their minds a junior partner.
Absolutely. No question.
So maybe it was something where if John had written that exact same song or Paul had written that exact same song, it may have gotten more consideration.
Yeah. They never, when George passed, what was Paul's statement? He mentioned him as being his little brother.
Yeah.
And even when speaking of All Things Must Pass, there's at least the Eric Clapton anecdote that when they began the rehearsals for the concert for George, and Paul showed up to do All Things Must Pass, Clapton claims that Paul was hardly even aware of the song. So I guess it made back there in January of '69, it just made so little impression on them, which is hard to believe.
Right. I mean, it's truly one of his greatest songs.
Absolutely.
I don't think George really got the respect until Abbey Road comes out. And then all of a sudden, objectively speaking, John and Paul and Ringo realized two of the best songs on the album are Here Comes the Sun and Something, and they're both by George.
He was gradually getting more respect. I mean, While My Guitar Gently Weeps is looked at as being one of the best songs on the White Album.
Yeah.
And even going further back to lead off Revolver with Taxman, I think that was a statement to itself,
Yeah. Well, with Revolver, obviously this is, some pretty well-worn turf. Obviously, George, it's his first time he gets 3 songs on the album.
Which is actually more songs than John had on the album.
On the American
album, right.
That's, could discolor some history there too. But no, if he's getting 3 out of what's on 14 on Revolver,
14, 3 out of 14.
Look, he's getting his share there.
But I think George is my next topic here, because I'm finding what went on during this time period so fascinating, because you keep hearing how frustrated George was gradually as he was blossoming as a songwriter and not being recognized as much. And as I pointed out in my podcast shows, and I think I even talked about it with you, Al, and you, Tom, when we were together the last time, he did so much work for Apple, for other artists.
Oh yeah.
When he went to John during this period and said, I'm thinking about making a solo record, and John is encouraging him to do so, he's also thinking, I can do this stuff on my own and then come back to the band. He wasn't thinking about completely, leaving the group altogether and just doing solo music. He saw that there was a benefit to continue with the Beatles. And I think during maybe that break when he quit the band temporarily, he had to reevaluate what was going on in his life with the group and see if he can accept his position in the band. And, the fact that John and Paul would always be dominating the group. And I think when he came back, he was comfortable with that. And it showed in the Get Back documentary how much fun he was having. And that, especially once they went to Apple, It was a whole different atmosphere altogether.
Oh,
I
yeah.
think he resigned himself to the fact that this was how it was going to be, but he saw a way out by thinking about having a solo career, and he wouldn't have been helping out Jackie Lomax, Doris Troy, Radha Krishna Temple, Billy Preston, you name it, unless he thought that there was a future still with being in the Beatles and with Apple.
Well, you know, you don't have to look any further than the night he walks out, right? The rest of that diary entry, which they only showed half of in Get Back, but if you read it in the I'm Mine book, you know, woke up, went to Twickenham, rehearsed, quit the Beatles, went home. Actually, the rest of that diary entry is went to Trident and worked on The King of Pho. So that night, he quits the Beatles. Let's get this right. He quits the Beatles and goes over to Trident to work on the Brute Force record, King of Pho. Okay. We actually had the pleasure last night, timing being what it is, on the Fab Forum to have Shyamundar Das, the Krishna who we see at the top of the show. He was our guest last night. It was very, very good. And we
was he very clean?
Very, very clean. And when we asked about, you know, starting to make records with George, first the Hare Krishna Mantra record, then Govinda, then the album, we said, so tell us, how does that happen? And we're talking about summer of '69. The Beatles are doing Abbey Road, and for whatever reason, John is not going to make it in that night, and they have a block of unused studio time. That's when he called them in. The guy is bursting with creativity at this point. He's, you know, he can quit the Beatles and go work with John Barham over at Trident to go work on a Brute Force record. Oh, we're not going to work on Abbey Road tonight? Guess what we'll do? We'll bring the Krishnas in. Okay, and we'll get them on tape, and I'll throw some harmonium and guitar on there, and guess what? We're going to have a record that's going to get them on top of the pops. Right. I mean, he, at this point, is just bursting with creativity. He really is. And look at the other records he does for Apple in '69. He does The Way God Planned It.
Killer
record. I mean, no, he is absolutely just blossoming at this point. And there's got to be some room made for him. There just has to be.
Well, that's where the solo records also come in.
Of course.
That's a great outlet for him right there. What are you going to do with all these leftover songs?
But George says it'll take me 10 years to put them out with the Beatles.
Yeah. The problem is that at that point, at that moment in time, there was no precedent for a group to do a sabbatical.
Right.
And the other members, you know, do solo material and then come back together. There was, at that point, it had never happened.
No, I mean, you can make the case quite clearly. They invented the solo career.
Bingo.
Quite clearly.
Yes.
You can make that case. You know.
Yeah.
And
although Mike Nesmith might beg to differ.
No, Mike can differ all he wants.
With all respect.
Yes.
But, you know, if you think about it, and I'm very big on, you know, having simultaneous careers and having solo careers. If you take a look at other acts that were successful, like the Beatles with solo careers, or trying to have them simultaneously, and certainly Fleetwood Mac, the Eagles, Genesis comes to mind, it creates more problems. Yeah, it creates more problems because it's hard to maintain both.
Yeah.
If a group goes on tour, how do you decide which material you're going to do? In the case of Genesis and Phil Collins, I mean, there was so much saturation of Phil Collins on the radio. I think it hurt Genesis a lot.
It
so
did,
there's all these complications that you don't think about before you start these things. They can easily happen. So, and in those days, you didn't, you know, Smokey Robinson left the Miracles. That was it.
Yeah.
No Smokey Robinson, and you know, and then going back to the Miracles, and so nothing like that.
But that, you know, that goes beyond, you know, all that, Ken. And I'll take it one step further. It's even when you write a song, do you go, this is good for the group, or this is for me? Yeah. And that actually manifests itself right in Harrison Camp with the Traveling Wilburys. One of Dylan's greatest songs of the late '80s, the song "Love Rescue Me," which he gives, you know, it goes ultimately on a U2 album, That was, from my understanding, that was, I don't want to say supposed to be a Wilburys record, but that's where that was to have landed. And that is one of Dylan's greatest songs of the 80s. Would have just loved to have heard that one in the hands of the Wilburys. So, I mean, you have to think about, I mean, Dylan's writing at the end of the 80s. What does he do with that song? You know, I mean, he works on it ultimately with Bono, and that's why it ends up on a U2 record. But why did he bring it to Bono? For some reason, he brought it there. And, why didn't he bring that to Jeff Lynne instead? I don't know.
He's the creative person. He's the one that has to make all those decisions and what makes sense in his mind.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about, and there's so many of them, what would be like your favorite musical moments? I mean, there were performances of certain songs, and in a way, I really enjoyed the fact that we saw how songs evolved, like Two of Us, being a fast version, and they slow it down and they change the guitar lick a little bit, doing things like that. The changes in Don't Let Me Down, taking that what do you call it, the call and response, the other line that was being used, which I think was kind of more early Beatles, if you think about it, because the Beatles did a lot of that stuff in their early years. I love seeing the evolution of a song like that, and I love that stuff. But my God, what came out of McCartney at this time, it's just mind-boggling. Not just the stuff that ended up on Let It Be, but also Abbey Road, his solo stuff, creating, you might laugh, but when he was working on Carry That Weight,
I mean,
and coming up with this whole other verse that they didn't end up using, but I find that fascinating. Whatever you take out,
for Ringo.
that doesn't, I know.
That's one of those things, not to bat out of order here, but when we were
didn't know that.
When we were talking about things we learned, we also have to talk about things we had to unlearn, right? One of the things I had to unlearn is 50 years of the big orchestral melody, the big symphonic reiteration of "you never give me your money because you're going to carry that weight the whole time." This was the message. They're telling the whole world you have to carry the weight of this. He wrote it as a
country.
I have to unlearn that. Okay. And that is one of my favorite musical moments. Paul sitting at the piano there when he does, coincidentally, Golden Slumbers and Carry That Weight, which become part of a medley, but they are clearly two separate and distinct songs.
Right.
And the second one has a life of its own. This comic number he's writing for Ringo that to me was one of the most sacred pieces of music I had ever heard. So, file that under things I had to unlearn.
Yeah.
I think, for me, one of the most charming moments was when I was listening to the 83 CDs. One of the more frustrating things I heard was John and Paul are doing Bye Bye Love. And Ringo at the same time is practicing the drum part to Two of Us, and George is working on the boom, doom, doom, doom part of Two of Us. And of course, it sounds horrendous. And Lewison's book says that was recorded on the 8-track. And I'm thinking, gee, wouldn't it be nice if someone took that, hint, hint, Charles Martin, and we had Bye Bye Love with John and Paul only doing the Everly Brothers. And lo and behold, it's not on the box set. And I'm thinking lost opportunity, but maybe it'll be in the film. And when it was in the film, that was my magical, I'm really glad that's in the film moment, because to me, it was just, magical to see John and Paul doing an Everly Brothers tune, just knocking it out like that and having fun with it in between takes of Two of Us.
Well, that's one of the many things to be grateful for from Peter Jackson. If you watch the interview that we did with him, his crew came up with this software where you can isolate everything, so you can take everything out that they're working on Two of Us, like you just said, and just concentrate on John and Paul there. So, and that's throughout the movie, imagine, and you can apply that to so much else in the Beatles catalog if you want to isolate their music.
They can
Imagine
make
what
a
you can
stereo
do.
version of anything now,
Yeah.
and they're probably doing it.
Yeah. Well, you know,
Hopefully.
there's a bootleg that's out of the Decca stuff in stereo.
Yeah.
And if you take Peter Jackson's software, it may sound even better than the bootleg. Who knows? But
can you make it sound good? Performance wise, just asking.
okay. I'm just
Yeah.
talking about the sound quality.
No, I understand.
Yeah. But that's yeah, that's remarkable, you know, what we can do with today's technology. But like I was saying, and I think sometimes John doesn't get enough credit. A lot of people say all he did was write Dig a Pony and Don't Let Me Down. But there were other songs that they were rehearsing that were his songs that
Mhm.
they didn't finish, but some of them were kind of good. I'm glad that Madman was one of the songs that was featured.
That was a
in this.
pleasant surprise.
That was another thing. I guess I didn't have to unlearn, but when you asked Ken, like, was it what you expected? I've heard that track, and it's a keyboard and a guitar. In my mind, okay, Paul's on the keyboard, and it must be John on guitar. Why would John jump off guitar and go play keyboards? And then when you watch it, I'm going, well, that can't be right. No, I had to unlearn that, okay? Because in my mind, listening to those, I've got that same '83 CD set, that Bruce has, and there's lots of passages where they're arguing over what they get for lunch and stuff. But when you go listen to the music parts, you naturally conjure up a visual of what it must have looked like of them doing this, and it was the complete 180 from what I figured. I just figured it's Paul on keyboards and John on guitar.
Right.
No. The other thing when you think of Madman, and the other thing when I was thinking Madman, I thought, Madman would have worked in the medley on Abbey Road, I think. But, I mean, it's a masterpiece as it is, don't get me wrong. And we know Her Majesty didn't work in the middle, but I think Madman might have worked in there. Just a thought.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I also in particular love when Paul went back and did Woman. Catering towards that's, unless you're used to the Nagra tapes and knowing all of it, that's a really nice surprise to know that he thought of it at that moment to play. And then going back to all the 50s stuff that like Just Fun, which he talked about, and Too Bad About Sorrows and those songs. And I guess thinking about those songs made them also want to bring back One After 909. So
right.
And that's where you're going to need another case of where you're going to need Let It Be, because you don't get, some of the fun rock and roll moments that are in Let It Be. Quite frankly, musically, they're not that great, but to see the Beatles doing it, to see George Harrison smile on You Really Got a Hold on Me makes it great in Let It Be. To hear it on a CD, it's horrible because you're comparing it to, the version that the Beatles did, with the Beatles or the Beatles' second album, and it's garbage. But to see him do it, so I was hoping that Peter Jackson would have had more of that rock and roll stuff that didn't necessarily sound great on CD, but might have looked / sounded good in a movie. So I would have liked more rock and roll stuff in the Get Back documentary.
yeah.
If I'm nitpicking, that's on my nitpick list.
Okay. Any other musical moments that you want to talk about?
Yeah. The sequence at Twickenham where Paul is sitting there at the piano and Mal's there kind of transcribing lyrics, things like that. And he's going through Long and Winding Road. That may have been the same sequence when he did bring out Carry That Weight. Or was that
because I think Ringo was there. Ringo had arrived.
Yeah.
I got this little song for you, Ringo.
Yeah, that is Twickenham for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And a few other things. And it's really fascinating.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think that's the same. Linda's there and she's sitting right across. And at the very beginning, Paul does, just a line or two from Another Day.
Yep.
Right.
And he makes a reference at some point to having a farm in Scotland. And Linda says, "Oh yeah, I'd love to have a farm."
Yeah.
And when you were talking about Bad Al, it reminded me one of my favorite sequences in Let It Be, unfortunately, it also was in Peter Jackson, is Ringo and George working on Octopus's
Yes.
Garden,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
George Martin singing backing vocals. I mean, how cool is that?
Yeah.
You know, and John on drums and the whole, I mean, it's just magical.
Yeah,
Mhm.
there's just so much, where I like when they know they got something. So when they're in the basement over at Apple and they go through that first, pretty good run through, actually, we get to see quite a bit of The Long and Winding Road. And they go into the control booth to listen to it. And McCartney knows he's got a winner. George Martin knows it's a winner. But they're going, all right, is it going to be like a Ray Charles thing? Is it going to be just bluesy like this? And George Martin offers up. He says, well, Paul, you said you wanted to do some strings on this, right? And Paul's like, maybe. How much unlearning do you have to do there?
Yeah.
Right?
Maybe some strings, but no harp.
Right, but
Yeah.
the whole breakup of the band, the thing he cited was Phil Spector, doing the work. Now, we weren't privileged to Paul and George Martin saying, hey, what do you think? Should we put strings or brass or a harp or anything like this? We weren't privileged to that, but Paul gives it he's got the maybe. Yeah. Like he at least entertained the thought of it.
Right.
Maybe he didn't want it in the end, and that's okay too. But it totally colors all this stuff, prior to seeing this 7-hour series. I'd have put all my chips on Paul did not want strings on Let It Be, period.
Well, I think though,
Long and Winding Road. Yeah.
I'll throw something out. Suppose,
end of discussion.
Yeah.
well, yeah, suppose one more thing, Tom. Suppose Paul had said, look, rather than us having Let It Be the single, why don't we make The Long and Winding Road the single? Then George Martin would have been in there putting tasteful strings and brass on Long and Winding Road. Just a thought.
Possibly. But again, Paul is completely non-committal at that point. He doesn't know and gives up a maybe.
Yeah.
And how much unlearning do you have to do there? Quite a bit.
A lot.
A lot. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think if George Martin had done the arrangement, the orchestral score, it would have been more restrained.
Yes,
definitely.
Probably.
But even still, as we pointed out in past shows, when Paul does the song live, he's got a string sound to it.
Well,
so he couldn't have been so averse to it.
Well, but he may have warmed up to that. Let's face it, because the first time he does it on the Wings tour in '76,
with brass.
The song is only 6 years old at that point. It's it's not an oldie yet. It's not really back catalog. It's still, it's his most current Beatles work. It's 6 years old, and he does not go the whole rep. You get the brass. You do not get all kinds of synthesized strings and all that other stuff.
Right. Okay. Yeah, but there's so many high moments here. We could just do a show on that. But
we didn't even mention the rooftops. So.
Yeah, we'll get to that too. But
sure.
I gotta bring up that jam that they did with the Dig It.
Yeah.
The jam of Dig It, where John is shouting out all the titles of Beatles songs, which was pretty cool. And the I Want You, She's So Heavy, I Have a Dream jam.
Yeah.
That was absolutely amazing. And Paul is doing he's playing slide guitar on that.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, at that point he's firing on all cylinders, McCartney. If he could pick it up, he could make music out of it. He could fall backward into the drum kit at that point. It would sound good.
Yeah.
He's in a groove, to say the least. Look at what he came up with that month. It speaks for itself.
Yeah. Speaking of drums, another big highlight is seeing John, Paul, and George play drums at certain moments, and to see
Heather.
Paul drum to Yoko's song.
Yeah.
To their jamming there.
Yeah. How about speaking of the drums, when Paul is demoing Let It Be and Ringo is just sitting back with his eyes closed? It's one of the funniest things. Paul goes, well, there wouldn't be much drumming now, would there?
Or George Martin on the, out of the control booth and on the floor for a bunch of it is kind of cool too. Where, okay, Glenn can handle the balance engineer work. I'm going to come out on the floor. I kind of enjoy those moments too.
Yeah, interesting to see George, what he actually did there, because, remember you had John saying, we don't want any of the studio magic and trickery here. We want this to be raw. And did George Martin feel like he had, his normal role there? And it was good to see that he was there supervising, a lot of what was going on musically.
Tom, that was another rewrite thing, because I think Glenn Johns kind of gave the impression of, well, George came to me and said, yeah, it's cool, you do your thing, and he's hardly ever there type thing. But George Martin was there a lot more. In Lewison's book, when he has George Martin ? You can erase that question mark.
Yeah. All these years, we've had this perception that that George's involvement was minimal and hardly.
To the point of not so much a musical direction, but in terms of giving the band direction. Again, it's one of the most poignant moments after Harrison leaves and Michael Lindsay Hogg is saying, well, are we going to do the thing on the boat with the torches and Paul says, we don't even have a location yet. George Martin brings them back to center and says, not having a location is not your biggest problem right now. I mean, they still needed that direction because they still didn't know where they were truly going with this.
Right.
And Martin tried to keep that ship steered, as best he could.
Yeah. And are we ready to blurt out things we learned in the film yet?
I've blurted out.
Before we do that, I'll ask. I want to ask one question before we get to that. What did you make of the meeting with Dick James? And did you feel that was really necessary at all in telling this story?
It was interesting.
In a painful sort of way.
Yeah, because you can feel that there was a fair amount of distance going on, especially between Dick James and Paul. You could tell there was some distance, and exactly, very icy. And and the others were kind of like, well, we're really not all that interested. But
why do you suppose it was put in there?
Well, it was not a whitewash film. This was something that happened. He was there. Peter Sellers was there for a little while. We'll put that in too. I think give a flavor of every significant thing that happened on any given day. I think, by doing the day by day approach, I think he probably, sat down, okay, what on that day is interesting? Well, it's interesting. Dick James is there. If Dick James had been there in 1963, it'd have been a lot different.
Yeah, I mean, at that point, he's perceived as one of the villains, and maybe it's just starting to build the breadcrumbs of what were some of the underlying non-musical issues. There was the whole publishing issue, Dick James, and of course, at the end, getting to Alan Klein, and Ringo delivers the best line of all. It'd be nice to have one of the con men on our side.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Leave it to Ringo.
Yeah, no, but I think. Though that was there really for the seeds of what else was going on here other than on the from the creative front. What other things were pulling them in different directions? Because at the end of the day, here comes a big wide jackpot kind of statement, right? You go into watching the Let It Be movie, and for years, what have we said? Oh, it's just like it's watching your parents get divorced. It's a documentary of a band breaking up. This, to me, it's like trying to watch a band not break up.
Yes.
Okay. It's like watching them try not to break up. And there are all these other factors, whether it's the publishing, whether it's George not having enough room for his music, and the things that weren't tearing it apart. I mean, the great foreshadowing moment in the whole thing. The thing that wasn't tearing it apart was Yoko Ono, because that's too easy a target. It has been for decades.
Right.
And the great foreshadowing moment, the words come out of McCartney's mouth. It's going to be funny 50 years from now. People are going to say the Beatles broke up because Yoko sat on an amp. Here we are 50 years later. There are people still believe that.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just the great foreshadowing moment, in the whole thing.
Yeah, and then Alan Klein, which is certainly an instrumental part of it all. This is where John meets Alan Klein. We don't see the meeting, but we hear about it. And we see John just going on and on enthusiastically about it. And Glenn Johns, who knows the history behind the Stones, is kind of trying to calm down, John. I think so. I think, it's the same. Glenn Johns wasn't more straightforward with John at that moment.
Yeah.
Well, John, I know, of course, he knows a lot about you and Yoko. He prepared for that.
Yeah, he was very prepared.
That's what he does. Let me tell you what he did with Mick and the boys. But he didn't never says that. If he says that, maybe things turn out different. But you also learn, and Paul says it about John with Yoko, but it's also John about Klein. John gets really excited about someone and he goes over the top.
Right.
Did that with Yoko. He did that with Alan Klein.
Yeah. He did it with Magic Alex.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. He was enamored of the guy.
Yeah.
Now, try to explain this then, because earlier I was talking about how things changed once the Beatles went to Apple and once John kind of took control. Why is it that the other Beatles are more cooperative when John is in control? And you can even make the parallel here that John got George and Ringo to side with Alan Klein. Why didn't they want to go with Paul?
Because Paul had in their mind, a conflict of interest in the thing of, Paul's going with the relative, going to the relative of the girlfriend. So they're naturally going to be suspicious. That's what I think, for what it's worth.
Because that meeting that Paul leaves for during one of the sessions, and you kind of assume that that's probably a meeting with with Lee and John Eastman.
Yeah.
We don't know that for sure, but it's a good bet.
He wasn't going to the dentist.
Exactly.
No, he was not.
Why is it if both sides couldn't agree, why didn't they try and find someone else?
Because John was enamored with Alan Klein. Plus, Alan Klein, right off the bat, goes in there and plays blackmail with EMI and gets a big increase in royalties.
Yeah.
So look what I did for you guys. I got you this higher royalty rate. You're getting so much more now per record that you sell. It's kind of hard to argue with that.
Yeah.
He also made sure he knew which songs were John songs and which songs were Paul songs, and that really impressed John.
And he knew a lot about Yoko, which impressed. He knew all about Yoko's concept art and the whole thing. And of course, John ate that up.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Okay. So getting back to your question there, Bruce, what you learned from this documentary. We'll start with you.
Primrose Park.
Yeah.
I had no idea that the Beatles were going to do an outdoor concert consideration at Primrose Park. I had to, get out my laptop and look up Primrose Park and look at the view of downtown London you had from it or whatever. And it was, I could have done something on the lawn at Primrose Park. That might have been cool. But where did that come from? In all the years that I've read about these sessions, in the bootlegs I've listened to, that to me came out of nowhere. And I really enjoyed that one.
Okay.
Minor to some people, but to me, it was so freaking cool.
All right, Al, anything from you?
Well, two things. One we mentioned before was the George Martin situation, where we found out how much he really was involved in this. But also, and I don't have the 83 CD.
You're lucky, Al. You're lucky.
Yeah. Really.
Don't rub it in.
Yeah, exactly. But again, one of these myths that we've had all these years was about how much distance there was between John and Paul by this time. And even at Twickenham, given, whatever, outside stimuli John had going, even at Twickenham, but certainly at Apple, the two of them it was the Nurk twins.
Right.
They were
like Bye Bye Love. That's why I love that song.
Yeah, exactly. They were as simpatico as we had ever seen them. And I think that's a real revelation. Also, and this is just ephemera, but not that any of the four of us are interested in ephemera, but if did you notice in the credits with the songs that some of the songs, like for instance, "Too Bad About Sorrows," are being published by NPL, which is
okay,
which is interesting.
Paul scarfed him up. Good for him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We even got to hear a few little bits of "Because I Know I Love You So" by the Weaklings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it was interesting. Some of the early tracks, "Just Fun" and "Thinking of Linking," we got to see all that early stuff. That was kind of cool.
yeah. Along those lines of what you were saying there, Al, about John and Paul getting along so well, I'm telling you, a very big moment, emotional moment, at least for me, is right before George quits and John and Paul are playing right opposite each other. They're standing right next to each other. They're only a few feet and they're looking at each other like they're in heaven.
Absolutely.
Like they're in love with each other practically. And George is on the sidelines there and he's probably thinking, I'm never going to be as close, as these two.
Yeah.
So,
Ken, I'm glad you brought up that moment because, when we see the film for the first time, we see January 10, and we know George is going to quit. So, like a hawk, I'm watching George's facial expression.
Yeah.
And you can see he's not angry. He's not pissed. He's brooding. It's a real serious, brooding look. And then, whenever, John tries to play "Talking About You," bad things happen. And he very calmly stands up and says, "I'm quitting the band now." And John says, "When?" He says, "Now." And even though we've read for years and years and years and years, and even in the film, they put on a little trailer, George says, "See you at the clubs." We still don't have any audio evidence that George ever said, "See you at the clubs," write NME and get a few replacements. And maybe he says, "See you at the club," but I've never seen it or heard it. And I don't know whether Peter Jackson put it in there because it's folklore, or maybe he does say it, but there's no evidence he ever says, "See you at the clubs."
Yeah.
Maybe it's like true. "Play it again, Sam." I don't know.
And then also, when they move over to Apple and they're jamming on something like "Old Brown Shoe," they're having fun.
Yeah.
And I felt good because, well, first of all, because it's a George song.
Sure.
After John seemed to not care for "I Me Mine" and dismiss that, here they found a song where they can really rock together and they're really enjoying their company. So, I said this in one of my podcasts, I forget which one, but when I finished watching all three parts, the first thought in my brain was, God, I wish John and George could watch this right now,
Yeah.
because their memories of that time are just so.
We're so colored by
Yes.
whatever, the politics of the time, the internal politics of the time, I think, especially in John's case.
Sure. Well,
Ken, I think, we could do this all night, but for the fact we have other lives and, I know we'll be having to wrap it up 10 or 15 minutes. But we have to talk about the rooftop, don't we?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
Absolutely.
I can give you a great bridge here as we go into the rooftop because it's one of the big things I certainly learned. And again, it was a matter of perspective. Again, think about watching the Let It Be movie. And, we see the 5 songs up on the roof, right? And when do the cops get there? Somewhere around the 3rd or 4th song. And, you get the sense it's coming to an end, right? And it plays out very well for the 20-minute concert that you're seeing. I was stunned how fast they were there.
Yes.
In this movie. And again, I think you guys have all been overseas. Right? Ken, have you been over to London to Savile Row?
I haven't been there. I did go to London.
Right, but the police station, the fact is it's a block and a half away from away from Savile Row. I mean, it wouldn't take long to get there. To walk it would be 2 minutes if it would take that long.
Right.
And they probably could hear it themselves.
Right. They were there, and we actually had the pleasure. We had Ray Dagg. We got to interview.
Oh, wow, you got him.
We're going to play it actually in 2 weeks on the 26th. This way, when it airs on the weekend repeats. It's running during the anniversary. And he was delightful. If you can get him on this show, Ken, you'll have a field day with him.
Okay.
But he told the story about, what they heard, when they heard it, and, were they getting complaints, and, and he sorts it all out for you and to tell you the best part. And, that was one of the big things I learned, was just how quick they got there. And again, just one of the funniest things I found in the whole series, because there was lots of great humor in this, is when, they're clearly blowing the cops off and biding time.
Them time.
Oh yeah.
We'll go find Derek Taylor. We'll go find Mal. We'll find their road manager. And he's talking and he says, can't they just shut the windows? Like, aren't these things soundproofed? They say, well, no, they're up on the roof. And what do you mean they're up on the roof? We had this conversation with Ray. I'd invite everybody to listen to it on the Fab Forum, but it's just so, I had to learn that, again.
Right.
And it was just terrific watching all that. And I don't want to give any spoilers out for our chat with Ray, but we were like, did you know you were being filmed when you were in AZ? Oh yeah, they thought they had like a two-way mirror that no one would notice, and meanwhile the thing's moving. So he was funny, and there's some great chat we're going to have with him. Tune into that the week of the 26th on the Fab Forum.
Yeah, I mean, when I saw the sequence, when I'd read about it in advance, gee, they're going to cut in with this and that, and it might not work. It was brilliant. You had the split screen, reminded me of Woodstock, obviously.
Sure.
Exactly. Right.
And, you had anywhere from full screen to 2 screens to 3 screens to 4 screens to 6 screens. And, it would be hard for me, because I've seen that sequence multiple times, for me to change where I would have said, if Peter Jackson had only done this, it really would have enhanced my enjoyment. I never thought that once.
No,
not at all.
Not at all. No. In fact, it's, on my short hit list, it looks like the DVD and Blu-ray that are coming is going to be a straight lift of what we saw on TV. And
exactly.
That's great. If there's a Blu-ray, trick that I'd love to see, I'd love to be able to pick the angle you watch the concert from. You want to watch it from the building across the street? Great. You want to watch it from the street? Great. You want to watch it from being on the roof? Great. And just, pick your own way to watch and hear the show. That's a fool's game right now trying to chase that. I think we're going to get exactly what was on Disney. That's our understanding. And that'd be just fine, by the way.
Yeah, I can live with that.
But Ken, you mentioned on both things we said today and on Talk More Talk, that you would rather have had simply,
just
simply
the concert,
just the band
and everybody on the rooftop there. And that doesn't mean I didn't enjoy what Peter Jackson did. I think that should be maybe a bonus feature, or just the Beatles alone on the Apple rooftop with everybody around them as a bonus feature. Sometimes I don't want to be interrupted with the music, with people on the street and what they're saying. I know it's all very interesting. And it was great that they had, the cops coming into the building and all the different shots there and what they had to say. And all that's fascinating. I think that was marvelously done, but I still want to see just the concert, and that's it. Pure concert.
Can I get that, by all means? But I have to say though, I was concerned that it was going to be intrusive and hokey and gimmicky, and it just wasn't to me.
No.
Yeah, no,
not at all.
Well, I never said it was any of those things.
I know you didn't. You're saying it'd be nice to have it as an option. I'm not going to argue with that, Ken. If they gave me that option, I certainly would watch that option.
Not only that, I'd love to see other angles of everybody around them. Yoko and Maureen there, Ken Mansfield there,
Chris O'Dell,
Kevin Harrington, Alan Parsons, anybody that was on the Apple rooftop. So, that's what I would have preferred. And, I hope that something like that could be a bonus feature.
Yeah,
considering the historical importance of this, I know that it's, to some people, it's not a concert, it's a glorified rehearsal, which I think one of us said. However you look at it, it's a part of history. And I would just have preferred if we had just gotten the music with no dialogue or anything
Yeah.
being a
But-
part of it.
But this was the payoff that Michael Lindsay Hogg had been lobbying for the entire the entire
And
length of the
Al,
project.
that's the problem with the end of the film that Peter Jackson has. Michael Lindsay Hogg is taking things and putting them in any order he wants. And he knows the rooftop, you can't top the rooftop. So before the rooftop, actually my second favorite part of Let It Be is two of us, long and winding road, let it be in a row. Boom,
Mhm.
boom, boom.
Yeah.
It's not in this film. You get a taste of it, and I understand why it's that way over
Yeah,
the
it would
credits.
be anticlimactic.
Yeah, it would have been anticlimactic. and all.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm looking forward to the remastered Let It Be, because I guarantee you, the first thing I'm going to do when I get that film is I'm going to click where it says two of us, and I'm going to watch those three songs in a row.
Yeah.
Right. Although you
Hmm.
already have Let It Be and Long and Winding Road on the 1+
Yeah.
DVD. Yeah.
Mhm. You do,
Yeah.
but still, it's just boom, boom, boom. You know.
Mm.
Well, I don't want you
And
to
also,
think
you
that I
don't
don't
have them in that
appreciate that
quality,
ending.
Al.
Yeah.
They're not in good quality. Okay,
Hmm.
one other
Yeah.
quick thing about the film that was fun to hear. I was one of these weirdos that always felt that no matter what Al Brodax and everyone else said, Yellow Submarine was not the third film. I always felt that Let It Be was the third film. It was interesting in this to hear John say, this could be the third film.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is true.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Wish I'd had that in time to put that in the Yellow Submarine book.
Uh,
As one more reason why Yellow Submarine was not the third film.
Okay.
And does that segue into anything, guys?
yeah.
Now I do want to well, it does. Why don't we, I know what you're thinking of there. Why don't we make this announcement? Bruce has a very special announcement to make us, which this is a first. No one else has heard about this till now.
Yeah, the past couple of weeks, I have been sending chapters of my next coming book to be proofed by Tom Frangione and Al Sussman. And the next coming book, after all, we did something with Magical Mystery Tour and Yellow Submarine. So I'm, obviously got to go back through the sea of time. And in this one, people have said, in the most part, they said, well, why don't you do Revolver next, or why don't you do Rubber Soul next? And no, actually, I'm going to do Rubber Soul 2 Revolver, which means it'll start with the British perspective of what was going on in the UK for these two albums. And then it will shift to the US. And of course, we get Yesterday and Today, and a full 44-page chapter full of very expensive to license Bob Whitaker photos from the Butcher session.
Wow.
And, the book's about 70% done. And your listeners out there may be able to help me, because I think the deadline is going to be February 15th, 2022. So if you're watching this 5 years from now, you've missed a deadline. But I'm looking for fan recollections. If you go to my website, Beatle.net, and it'll tell you, about that. We're going to be sending out an announcement tomorrow, which will probably be today when they're watching this. But anyway, if you have special memories about any of these one things, so, maybe you peeled the Butcher cover back, the trunk cover back and saw the Butcher cover, or peeled it and saw cardboard, or what you first thought of Rubber Soul or Revolver, or the first time you heard Tomorrow Never Knows, we love to hear these things. I know Tom particularly enjoys the fan recollection section, and with that segue, I'll turn it over to Tom.
Yeah, the last books, and the team that puts these together, Bill King and Al and Pierce Hemmingson up in Canada. Look, I have all the Bruce quote, the reference books, and we get to read all the chapter by chapter recording details in Beatle Fan. So it's not that it's quote, oh, that old yarn again. But clearly the fan recollections are that's the new stuff. Okay. That has to be new to me, that, so Al got it for his birthday that year. And this is how it all, that kind of stuff, is really, really cool to read again, because we're so involved in this as a community through the fest and through all the podcasts and through, Beatle Fan and through everything else. That, well, one, it's always bonus points if you know the person. Go, oh, I know that person from the fest. Oh, look, whoever's. But we hear that stuff on the Fab Forum too. People call in because something connects with them. Everybody has a Beatles story somewhere. Everybody does. So it's a bottomless well to go to.
So your deadline is February 15th.
15,
and when do
yes.
you expect the book to be out?
The plan is for the book to be out a street date in October. We'll probably begin advance orders around, I think probably, the actual day that I think I'm going to do advance orders is going to be what we believe to be the day of the photo session for the trunk, what ended up being the trunk cover. So that'll be a late April. I think maybe it's like April 29th, or don't hold me to that. Could be April 25th for all I know. But one of those dates, we will start taking pre-orders. And for people who pre-order, you will get the book a couple of weeks earlier if the U.S. Post Office does its job correctly, than the official street publication date. For those who buy the books directly from my website, it's greatly appreciated because obviously I make more money through direct sales. And of course, by appreciating that, I also sign every book that comes from the website, Beatle.net. And also I'm willing to personalize it. And the people who buy directly from me are the people that make it possible because, as I said, the licensing alone on this book will be extremely expensive because of all the Bob Whitaker pictures that I'm using, not just for the butcher cover, but also for the, the paperback writer Abbey Road color promos thing and things like that. So, and about 10 ones from the Beatles book that are essential pictures as well.
Okay.
Right.
So,
Al, anything you want to add about the book?
besides Al's chapter is great. I've already read it.
No, thank you, sir. Yeah. Again, I did, pretty much what kind of the change in times formula and just applied it to that period. So we cover a lot of, there is some Beatles material in there, but also a lot of what else was happening in the world and in pop culture and all.
A little thing called Project Gemini, for instance.
Yes, exactly.
Great.
Kind of like changing times.
Kind of like.
Yes.
And that's why I wanted Al to do that work for me.
Yeah.
All right. Before we go, I want to throw one question out to you guys. And I don't want this to even sound negative because what you had said earlier on, Tom, you just spoke so perfectly about this period of January of 1969 being a period of compromise and watching it unfold between all four of them. But it's easy to take a look at this and all that they accomplished. And it's a wonder to watch all this in this documentary. There's no question about it. So what if I was to say, well, they didn't really give a full concert. Okay. And they also didn't record an entire album.
Nope.
It was close, but it wasn't a full album yet. And they also didn't have a TV special. I mean, the only deadline the Beatles imposed was on themselves to have this work done by the end of January. And they could have easily picked themselves up, as they did, and went back into the studio February 22nd, worked on I Want You, She's So Heavy. Maybe a lot of these songs that were on the Let It Be album would have ended up on Abbey Road. Who knows? So why is it important to you to study this particular period? I know it's fascinating to watch the creative process. That's the most fascinating thing to me of all, to see it unfold right before your eyes. But what is it about this time and certainly the way that it's presented here that makes it so important to study this time?
Well, I think it's like asking why you climb a mountain, Ken, and the answer is because it's there.
What?
This is hands down, the best documented and preserved and recorded period of their entire existence. Yeah, we have newsreel footage from the tours and stuff like that, but in terms of them working creatively, we've had people, write in because they're not as steeped in this as us and saying, do they have this much footage from each one of their albums? They should make a series of these and watch how they did Sgt. Pepper and Abbey Road and the White Album. And
if only.
If only. No,
Yeah.
I think they pretty much learned that they weren't going to do that for Abbey Road. That's why we don't even have a lot of still photographs from it.
Yeah, that's true.
I think you do it because it's really golden opportunity to see how it works. Yes, if I could get 1 month of any, period from 62 to 70, I'm not sure January 69 would have been my first pick. It'd probably be somewhere in 66 while they're working on Revolver or something, or Penny Lane, Strawberry Fields, and really steep, myself in something like that. But, that's just not going to happen. So I think, a lot of it is by circumstance, frankly.
And Tom, using your
that the
album
end is still
analogy,
going to have a ton of riches in it. You're not coming out with a bunch of mediocre stuff. You're going to see Let It Be come out of it, and Long and Winding Road, and Don't Let Me Down, and and Get Back, and all the rest of it.
Yeah, and taking that album analogy, one of the things is, what's the hardest mountain you've ever climbed in your life? And the answer pretty much is the one I just finished, because everything has its own challenges. So this period in time had its own challenges. When John talked about it from a contemporaneous standpoint, he absolutely complained how horrible it was, the worst month of his life. And for years said the same thing. But what I found fascinating is to watch it. It wasn't a whitewash. You see the tensions, but you also see there were a lot of fun moments too. And the weird thing about John, and how John's mind works differently than many, at least close to when they finished it, when John looks back at Let It Be, he thinks the really hard and miserable times, where I think when most people look back at something with the mixed in that, they remember the good, because that's easier on your psyche to remember the good. Yet John, unfortunately, focused on the bad. And one of the tragic things about John was, like George Martin says, I asked him about songs, and John, well, everything could have been done better. Take Across the Universe, brilliantly done. And John, for some reason, it's terrible. We need to redo it for Let It Be. And of course, it's horrible when they try to do the song. And it was just John's perception. And I think that's one of the sad things about him, was he wasn't able to sit back and say, yeah, we had some really great times there. We did some really great music. And it took him a long time to be comfortable with what they had done.
Sometimes you need that time to distance yourself before you can really look back and realistically look at how things were. So
yeah, and just from from a historical point of view, the problem is that things like Lennon Remembers, like the Doug Sulpy book, things like that, have presented us with a distorted view of what that month was really all about. And I think that's one of the most valuable things about this, is that we get, and again, without any contemporary revisionist history, just simply presenting the way it was, I think we get a much more honest, much more, much truer view of what that part of their history is all about. Plus the fact that, as Tom said, it is the only extensive documentary long form footage of the Beatles in the studio. There's nothing else,
and it's a miracle that it was done.
Yeah.
And now I love the fact you say, I agree with you all that. No talking heads and no contemporary pop star who was born 40 years after the fact to say, oh yeah, this is really interesting to see the Beatles playing up on the rooftop. Okay, whatever.
Yeah.
I was really glad it had none of that.
Right. None of the 8 days a week stuff, where you've got people who obviously are not really, they're there because they're names, that kind of thing. I think this was much more honest,
Yeah, and especially when you have a moment like the meeting that John and Paul had in the cafeteria, saying what they did to each other. I mean, that's very personal stuff right there.
Yeah.
And I'm so grateful we got to hear this. They could have just as easily have said, no, that's not going out.
Yeah. Yep.
And that was new to, I think, everybody. Tom, I don't believe that was included on the Niagara Reels anywhere. So.
I've not seen or heard that. No way.
Well, again, that all comes down to that software that Peter Jackson had. We can block out all the extraneous noise and just hear John and Paul talk.
Yeah.
That was amazing, so revelatory right there.
Yeah.
To hear Paul say, I'm not really comfortable being the leader. You're the leader, acknowledging that. And,
one thing was clear: George was not going to be the leader. That was clear.
Yeah, and somebody pointed out that that hearing them, and they don't know that they're being recorded, but they're talking in their real Liverpudlian voices. They're not talking in their what you would call their I guess their public voices. These are two guys who are still, they're a decade
Scouse
separate.
Right. Scouse accents. No
two Scousers.
No London elocutions and and all that other stuff. And they even have subtitles, which was kind of neat.
Right.
Yes.
No, that was important. Yeah. Keep everybody focused.
Yeah.
It's so interesting that they had that cafeteria talk. Imagine if they recorded the meetings they had with George when he quit. How much in demand do you think that would be?
Or,
I think
for the moment before the rooftop, Tom, where, they say, they weren't sure whether they were going to do it or not. And then John eventually says, "Oh, F it, let's go."
Yeah.
That would have been cool to have.
Just the subtitle that Jackson put on there, they go to George's house for a meeting. The words go away, and then the next words are, "It did not end well."
Yeah, that was brilliant.
Yes. That was classic.
Sometimes, a few words is more than enough. As in that case, it did not go well.
Okay.
Unlike the documentary, which went very well.
Yeah.
One last thing before we go, but one high moment for me was to see the Beatles in the basement at Apple right after the concert.
That was
yes.
To see the look on George's face when John screwed up the lyrics of "Don't Let Me Down" and he's laughing.
Yeah,
he never got it right.
And Ringo and Linda holding each other's hands. That was very nice.
Yeah.
Which also made me think about something else. We know that Yoko and Maureen were on the Apple rooftop. Why wasn't Linda there?
Too cold?
Too cold, maybe. Who knows?
I don't know.
Yeah. It's possible.
I had no idea Linda was in the building.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Got there late. Who knows?
Yeah. Okay. Linda shows up at 2:30 in the afternoon or whatever. Am I in time?
Yeah. What?
Okay. Well, this has been beyond wonderful. Thank you guys for doing this. This was an incredible conversation. You're welcome back anytime. So thank you all for doing this, and I will provide links in my description box for Bruce's website, for SiriusXM, for anything you want me to post, Al. Just let me know.
Great.
And thanks to all of you for watching this, and please subscribe to my channel and to pay attention to all these guys and their works. Okay, so thank you all for tuning in.
Thanks.
We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Ken. Enjoyed it.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.